good morning. Nice to see you. Sunday school. This is wonderful. Having this many people in Sunday school. I'm glad you guys are all here. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you very much for the privilege we have of learning about you and your word and this world that you have created. Help us to be challenged, to be stretched a little bit. Also, in our stretching, Lord, that not be the end goal. That transformation, service, love, that these are the things that change in our hearts. This might be just a little piece of that, just the beginnings of that, because we're messing with our intellects mostly, but we want that ultimately. So help us to understand this word that you've given us in various ways, all the ways that we talk about today. Be each mind here, each soul here, and we pray. All right, so I think most of you have copies of the notes. If you don't, I have one copy here. Okay, the first guy. Sorry, I'm already looking at him first. If anyone else needs one, certain couples are willing to share.
I'll give some more.
So we're going to talk about hermeneutics today. How many of you know the word hermeneutics? Right. Thank you, Gavin. I know it, and I want to kill myself because you talk about nothing else ever, Papa. Thank you. So we're going to talk about hermeneutics. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. We're going to mess with your minds a little bit today. Where we go next week, I've written something for next week, but I don't know if that's where we're going to go yet. It depends on where we go today. So I don't know my audience yet, and that's hard. Usually you teach classes and well, they have to have this amount of knowledge, they have to get to this level, they have a class, they have a test they have to take, right? This is a very different world for me, since I don't know where you're at or what you will participate in or something like that. So we'll play. We'll play together and we'll see what ends up happening here. So the format of this is mostly going to be me talking. But that does not mean that you can't stop me anytime, and it doesn't mean that, like, when I ask questions that you're supposed to be quiet, right? You're supposed to actually give me feedback, talk to me about stuff. So, and there'll be at least certain spots where I do that a lot. So, hermeneutics. You have your notes. If you want to take notes, you can. If you don't, you can just crumble that up and throw it away. Just don't do it right in front of me, right this second. Okay, wait till you leave out there, and then I'll check the trash cans later. Dwayne brings me the trash cans. Like, look, 19 people threw away their correct. All right. So hermeneutics. Right. Here's our big word that very few people know. Hermeneutics. So you guys know Hermes?
Yes.
Yeah, this ancient god, this Greek god. Greek? Yeah. Right. What's he god of? Speed. Message. Right? He brings messages. Goes around super fast and flies and brings messages to the other people that need it. So this is it, right? We've got messages now that we want to get across. Here's the message that we're going to be talking about most, but hermeneutics doesn't deal with the Bible. Hermeneutics deals with literature. Actually, it even deals with things more than literature. It deals with any kind of conversations that we have. So let me define it before we get into the next thing. So definition of hermeneutics is the art and the science of interpreting or understanding. The art and the science of interpreting and understanding. Okay, so it's a science in that I'm going to give you rules to follow, but those rules are not rules in the sense that if you just do this, you all get the same answer. Because you know that when we're dealing with the Bible, we don't always get the same answer, right? That's why we got Presbyterians, and we got Methodists, and we got Charismatics, and we got everybody else, and they all see the same verse, and they see something different there. So the rules are not going to apply. It's also an art. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff that are going to go into this that I'm going to talk about for 12 weeks. So just to totally put, and this is a 30-hour class, a 3-credit class brought down into 12. Okay, so this is going to be hard, so I got to talk really fast. That's what I do. So no. Like I said, wherever we get to is where we get to. And it's perfectly fine that if we don't finish this. I may just go a totally different route and just say, here's 12 ways to read. And I'll just talk about that stuff off the cuff and just drink it in and say, oh, thank you, this is so fun. So what do we interpret? Every day we're interpreting things. We interpret conversations, right? You just interpreted what I just said as some sort of a joke, right? That you thought, okay, he's not an elitist, pretentious jerk when he just said that. You laughed, right? Now some of you were like, I didn't laugh, I thought it was kind of elitist. And, okay, you missed it. You've interpreted poorly. Okay, so whenever I say great things about me, I'm usually joking. Okay, I don't have that big of an ego, but it's not huge. Okay? All right, so conversation, of course we're going to do it. Like, what about a newspaper in the morning? I don't interpret newspapers. Newspapers are just the facts, right? Right? We all know that's ridiculous. I mean, what kind of newspaper do you buy? You buy this conservative newspaper or this liberal newspaper because you know they have slants, and you know you have to interpret. You got to read between the lines and figure out what they're really trying to say. Everything has an agenda. By the way, so does your Bible. There's not a text in here that doesn't have an agenda. I'm going to say this a million times. Ink is not cheap. Paper is not cheap, especially in their day. They're not writing just to give you some fun. Okay, there's an agenda here. They want to get something across to you. But we're not talking about the Bible yet. We're talking about newspapers. We're talking about conversation. We're talking about, I don't know, literature class in college. Do you remember a literature class? Shakespeare.
Oh.
Yes, that's what I think about Shakespeare too. Unless it's performed. Then it changes. Have you ever read Shakespeare and wanted to shoot yourself, but then seen it performed, and you're just like, it just came to life because you see them doing things? And now you can figure out that weird cadence and that weird rhythm and rhyme and all that stuff. It makes sense. Even if you didn't understand that line, it makes sense because they're doing something at the same time. It all works together. That's literature. There's genres, right? We're going to be dealing with that. But especially today, our goal is to interpret the Bible. Okay? Now, we're going to talk a lot about this Bible. I have a whole other class someday in the future on the messy Bible that we have and how it's so much more complicated than we can ever imagine, okay? And yet so much more beautiful in its complicated messiness. But we're not going to deal with that right now. We're just going to talk about how we do this. So let's talk about, we talked about definitions, art and science of interpretation. We talked about what to interpret, anything, anytime. There are more chairs coming, as you see. I'll have to keep moving back here, keep making more rows. Not a terrible thing to have to deal with. Like I said, next week, no worries, right? No one will come back. So you'll have plenty of room if you want to be here. So why? The question is, why should we interpret the Bible? Like, why in the world are you here to do this? Okay, what's the point of all this? Well, you know that it's a divine book, right? We're going to make some presuppositions here. This is a divine book. This is from God. But it's not the Quran. It is not handed down from on high, hence the messy complicatedness of it. This book is inspired, but it's organically inspired. So we mean something very different. We'll talk about this more next week, probably. Okay? We don't mean that God has written this, or that God has whispered into someone's ear and that they have transcribed it. Transcription theory has been dead for centuries. No one believes that. God works through the author's understanding of things, their political ideologies, their bad grammar. Yes, the Bible has bad grammar. And sometimes it has amazing grammar, because some of the authors are really good at what they do and some aren't. Okay? And that's in your Bible, in your messy, complicated Bible. But the point here is it's divine, so we definitely want to interpret. If God is sending us a love letter, we want to interpret it, right? We want to know what it says. You have ever gotten a love letter? Do you remember that? Now, when you get that love letter, what does it have? You just kind of put it there on the piano and let it sit there until the next love letter comes, and then you set it down, and then you set it down, right? You just keep it. No, I mean, what happens? Usually on the way back from the mailbox, you're ripping it open, you know who it's from. Oh, yes, it smells good, right? And then you start interpreting. Oh, wait, what does she mean by this? What does he mean? Oh no, is this a breakup? Oh, yeah, right? And you got to read the whole concept. All that's interpretation. Okay, this is a divine love letter to you, so you definitely care about this text. But because it's divine, you might think, well, doesn't God just give us all the answers? Right? He says specifically he will lead us into all truth. But we know he doesn't give us all the answers, right? Because, did I mention this? Presbyterians, Methodists, Charismatics, right? Grace Brethren, we all see different things. Even this morning's sermon, some of you were like, daggone it, that was beautiful. Pacifism, bring it. And some of you are like, that is not what Jesus meant. He meant something very different, punch you in the face for sure, right? Because we have come from different perspectives, we have different baggage. In fact, we're going to get to that presupposition in a second. It is also, so it's a divine book, but it's a human book. Human books are understood as human books. There's literature in here just like literature that you're used to. Okay, it has rhyme. There's a reason that this word was chosen over this word. There's beauty in it. There's all kinds of cool, like, chiastic structures, where the center point is this, not the number 1 point, not the number 2 point, but the fourth one. And then number 3, it looks very much like 3 prime, and 2 looks like 6, right? You guys remember that? It was usually A, B, C. Remember this from your literature classes? This works in our literature too. In the Bible, it's there. It has different ways of doing it, but even things like introduction statements. Like if I say something like, what's the beginning of a nursery rhyme, or
Once upon a time.
if I say once upon a time, what do you know? You know automatically this is not a historical story, right? Those kinds of things exist in our Bible, you just don't know about it. Because you don't know Hebrew. And you haven't read a commentary maybe on that passage, but it might say something right there at the beginning that tells you, hey, don't read this as a history book. Read this as something else in this particular place. If I say, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, you know right away, right? God's not a shepherd. You know that's metaphor. So you're supposed to read it differently than you read, and the shepherd walked in the sheep with the field, right? You get what I'm saying. Okay, so it's a regular human book. So it's got divine, it's got human somehow incarnated into the same thing. I use that word very specifically, right? That is, it's put on flesh in some way. Just like Jesus in some way is both divine and human. So Jesus has this divine aspect. He's God himself in human flesh, but he doesn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but makes himself a servant. So, like, if he falls while he's doing tricks on his skateboard, he's going to skin his elbow just like any of you would, right? Do you ever think about that? Like, Jesus got cuts and bruises and probably was tempted to say a bad word when he had his hand with the hammer, right? But he didn't, because it's Jesus, maybe. Right? When the cute girl walked by, Jesus is a guy, and when he's 14 years old, he's thinking some thoughts maybe, or almost thinking. You don't want to think about this stuff, do you? This is Jesus. But he's also human. It's absolutely essential that you understand the humanity of Jesus in order to grasp what's going on in Scripture. Okay? You can't just see the divinity. We always emphasize one, not the other. That's true of the Bible too. I need you to see it's a human book. It has all the human practical things that are in there. It has all the political ideologies, what we call propaganda. Okay, but it's propaganda from God's view. Right? He's trying to get across something. Propaganda isn't automatically bad. It's also sometimes very good if it's the right thing that it's trying to motivate you to do. All right, anyway, so sometimes it's really hard. Okay, this is my third point under why I interpret the Bible. It's a divine book, it's a human book, and sometimes it's really hard. So let's play for a couple minutes. Okay, let's look at a couple of verses. Now, if you were at my first class, I think we did this one. This is the first class, don't worry, but I gave like a little precursor to this in our summer series just to get people excited and get you to come to this class. So thanks for coming. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. If you got a Bible, which, you know, of course you would come into a Bible study. No guilt, I'm just saying. Isaiah 7:14. Do you know Isaiah? My app is opening, that's fine. Yep, wherever you got a Bible, it's fine. iPad, you got it all memorized, even better. Isaiah 7:14 says this, therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. You've heard this one? The virgin will conceive, or in my NIV, the virgin will be with child, and will give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. Okay? You know this verse, and you know what it means already coming into this text, right? Come in this class, you all know what this is. This is a prophecy of who?
Isaiah.
Jesus. What?
Yeah.
I heard somebody say something different.
I said Isaiah.
Isaiah. Yeah. So everyone else said Jesus, but she said Isaiah.
Sorry about that.
Well,
It's good to be different.
probably closer to being right than Jesus. I mean, there's nothing in here that says that it's about Jesus. What makes you think it's about Jesus?
The virgin.
Emmanuel? Virgin?
The New Testament says it's about Jesus.
Ah, okay. So now we're doing interpretation of interpretation. See, this is where things get really messy. We're reading Matthew, who's talking about this. Matthew or Luke? Maybe both. I'm pretty sure it's Matthew. But he talks about a virgin conceiving, and he uses this verse. But is this what Isaiah is talking about? Do you think that other people interpreted this verse that way? See, this is some of the things that we're going to be dealing with in this class, is how do other interpreters deal with this class? And I don't want to get too deep into this because I'm going to mess with it in the rest of the class. I want to show you how to interpret New Testament texts that are interpreting Old Testament texts and what they're doing with all of this. But this verse says he's going to be called Emmanuel. You guys know that Jesus is never once called Emmanuel, right? He's named Jesus. That's his name. Jesus Bar Joseph, maybe. But not Emmanuel. So you're like, oh, but it means Emmanuel because Emmanuel means God with us and he's God with us. That's a lot of work to get there. If Isaiah is thinking all of that stuff. In fact, it says that he's going to eat herds, he'll be called Emmanuel, eat curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. But before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. Now, wait just a second. If this is Jesus, and they have a particular problem about two kings, the kings of Assyria and Syria, really about Syria and Israel, because this is Judah that's dealing with it, these two kings, and Assyria is being called for help, these two kings are going to come down, and you're worried about those two kings. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good to give you a prophecy that's not going to take place for another 600 years. Right? It says, before these old enough to reject wrong and choose the right. I don't know when you think that is, that age of accountability, if it's 3 or 4, if it's 13 or 14, but it's not 600. Right? Because they're all dead by then. So before you do that, choose the right. The land of the two kings you dread will be laid to waste. This is a very specific prophecy about somebody who's coming very quickly. Okay, but we all know it's about Jesus. And by the way, it is about Jesus, but it's not as simple as you think. Okay, so don't get me wrong. This is going, I wouldn't call it a prophecy so much as I would a type, but it is going to reference Jesus, and Matthew is going to do it. We're going to get there in another class. Right now, I just want to mess with you. Okay, that's
Good
kind
job,
of the point of
good
all
job.
this. All right, good. How about, let's see here. I won't do every single one, but let's do a couple others. How about Jeremiah 31:15? So we're talking about prophecies. Jeremiah 31:15. This is also interpreted in the New Testament. This is what the Lord says. A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because her children are no more. Who's Rachel? What? Joseph's mother, right? Israel. Okay, a representative of Israel. This is Rachel, Jacob's wife, the more beautiful one, or whatever, the one that he loved, not the one he hated. That's an interesting interpretation too, isn't it? It actually says that the one that he hated was Leah. Do you think he hated her? But that's the word that we use. And then we get into the New Testament, and Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Did he hate her? Did he hate him? I don't think he hated, but he did favor one over the other. So we're talking about favor, that's totally other thing. We'll get to that, maybe we'll get to that one. Because that's the whole predestination stuff, right? We get into Romans chapter 8 and 9. Okay, but I know better than to mess with that one right now. So this one is just a voice is heard in Ramah, right? What's she weeping about? What's she upset about? What's happened to her children? They've been taken away or been killed. By the way, same thing in most of the biblical passages. So if you're exiled, it's the same as dying because you're outside of the presence of God. Think Genesis chapter 1 on this, or Genesis chapter 3, right? In the day you eat of it, you will surely where they don't die, and you start making interpretive leaps like, oh, well, that means that they died spiritually, but it doesn't say anything about that, right? So it's got to be that because they're not dead, or maybe God forgave them, or maybe it's a symbol of something bigger that you know that when the Bible uses the word death, it usually means outside of the presence of God. Therefore, exile, and Adam is exiled from the land of plenty, from the presence, from Israel, from the land that he was given. Humankind, Israel, has been moved outside of the land, exiled. Maybe the Adam story is an Israel story. Right? We can start jumping to all these other things. So your interpretation might be right, but so might mine. Okay, but whatever it is, this is not talking about, you remember where this is used? Good interpretive hermeneutics people. Do you remember Jeremiah 31:15? Do you know where it comes? If you've got a good study Bible, you can probably figure it out. Mine says, quoted in Matthew 2:18, where Herod's orders to kill all the male infants in Bethlehem and its vicinity are stated as to be a fulfillment of this passage. So the same thing that was just brought up. Matthew says it's a fulfillment of this. But Jeremiah is not talking about that. Right? Not at all. And you can see he's clearly not talking about that. And yet, it is seeming to stretch a whole lot further than Jeremiah thinks it's going to stretch.
Sir?
Yeah?
But doesn't Matthew say it is the fulfillment of?
Yeah, that's what I just read. You got it perfectly. Herod's order, yeah, it says Matthew are stated to be the fulfillment of this passage. Yeah. So if Matthew says it, it is the fulfillment of this passage, but I don't think Jeremiah would agree with you.
Well, Peter says they didn't know.
That's right. So what's happening with these kinds of things? Like, Jeremiah is speaking of one thing very specifically. It's not Jesus. It's not the Herod stuff. Okay, he's talking about something. You can see it clearly in the context of this passage. He's not talking about that. And yet somehow it connects to a whole other level out there. Okay, we've got to figure out how to make that leap. And what we normally do is we make that leap Jesus. When in reality, it should probably be taking a few jumps to get there. And those jumps, which we're going to talk about like, I don't know, week 4 or 5, those jumps are hugely significant in how you accomplish, and how you get to this spot. Because you're going to start seeing Matthew and Luke and Paul and all these people doing some really weird things with these passages unless you can see the jumps that are being made here. The way that they thought in their time how interpretation works. By the way, they didn't interpret the way you interpret. Okay, you have a very specific way we call it grammatical historical interpretation. They didn't do that. They messed with you. Way more than I will. Remember, Paul, Sarah and Hagar are mountains. And they're covenants. You're just like, yeah, no, they weren't. They were actual people that, no. And then he uses this word, he says, by allegoria they are. Allegory. He can allegorize? Are we allowed to allegorize? Right? Song of Solomon is all about, can I say this? All adults here? The 2 breasts of the woman of the Old and the New Testament? Why not? By the way, that was an interpretive view of the Alexandrian school for centuries. That's how they saw this. Are they all wrong and morons? We just have a better way of doing it? So that's why I said it's an art. It's not a science. There's all kinds of things going on here. Okay, good. We're still good. How about, we're not even going to turn to this one. 2 Timothy 2:15 says that you will be saved through childbearing. Women will be saved through childbearing. Do you remember that passage?
Yeah, but it says,
What in the world? Right? So it's either saved by grace through faith alone, or... Right? Yeah. So ladies, well done. I mean, you're in. What is Paul doing here? Right? There's some New Testament passage about, I don't know if anybody's got braided hair in here. Anybody braided hair today? Nope, probably because you read the Bible. Right? Because you're a floozy if you have braided hair. Right? You're not allowed to braid your hair. Did you know that you're not allowed to have roofs without fences on them? Anybody here have a roof with a fence on it? You're all going to hell. What do we do with these passages? This is what I'm trying to say. Do you know that James and Paul seem to disagree pretty strongly about salvation by faith? Do you look at that. Look at that verse. James 2:24. I'm going to do James next year. We're going to preach through it. I'm pretty sure. because we are going to bring a joy to the city, and James rocks when it comes to that. James, of course, I can't find it. James? Did I tell you that I'm an Old Testament scholar? James 2:24. Yeah, Jesus, Paul, they're in there somewhere. I don't know very much about them. James 2:24 says, "You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone." Romans chapter 3, verse 28. 3:28 says, "We maintain that man is justified by faith apart from observing the law." Now, if I were to line the Greek structure up behind, they say exactly opposite things. So when I preach through this, I've preached through pieces of James before. I call this a Paul and James cage match. Like, put them in the cage and let them fight this thing out. Because they seem to disagree, but I don't think they do, actually. But only if you can do hermeneutics, only if you can figure out what's going on here, unless you have a bigger context. You understand how the genres work. You understand why James is writing his letter and why Paul is writing his letter. Very different reasons. Neither of them are giving you strict theology like a theology textbook. Both of them are writing occasional letters. That is, letters that deal with a particular problem. And you don't know what the problem is except for by reading only one side of the story. So you've got to jump in. Romans is to Rome. And Paul might be writing something very different even to Ephesus or to Galatia, even if he's talking about the same thing. By the way, Paul is almost always talking about the same thing. Okay? How do Gentiles get accepted into this new world? And yet he writes different letters to explain it to them. That's always what's going on. I mean, how do we deal with questions like, well, remember we did it Isaiah 14. We got to do that one. Let's look at Isaiah 14.
Pastor, can I ask a question?
Yes, but I probably won't answer it because I'm messing with you. But go ahead. No, you can ask it.
Okay. Isn't there a definite article in 2 Timothy 2:15, so it's saved in the childbearing?
Oh gosh, I don't even know. I don't know.
It is in the
Maybe.
Greek, I believe.
Well, you know better than me. Yep. Yeah, I'm not doing any exegesis on it right now, but you're right. We would have to do that.
I apologize.
No, not that's exactly right. But that's what some of the hermeneutic stuff is, right? We've got to do some exegesis. We got to know what's going on in the Greek text. We got to know what's going on in the genre of the letter. There's these bigger and smaller things as we get down, but that's exactly what you need to look for. What does the definite article mean? Does it pertain to something else? Does it help us in our understanding of these things? I don't want to answer any of these questions, but Isaiah chapter 14, 12 through 14, I did this one before. "How you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn. You've been cast down to the earth. You who once laid low the nations, you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God." I don't know if you know, stars of God are spiritual beings. "I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly." This is a sacred mountain where the assembly of God, the divine council, sits. "On the utmost heights of the sacred mountain, I'll ascend above the tops of the clouds. I'll make myself like the Most High, but you brought down to the great." You know who this is, right? Everyone knows what Isaiah 14 is talking about, right?
Satan.
Satan! Yeah, it says Lucifer. And what makes you think that Lucifer is Satan? Because of this passage. But if this isn't talking about Satan at all, then your equation of Lucifer and Satan is an unbounded equation. Because this is where it shows up. And, by the way, it's definitely not talking about Satan, because all you've got to do is read the context to find out. Look at chapter 13 at the very beginning there. "An oracle concerning Babylon." All right? This is a prophecy of Babylon, how the king of Babylon has set himself up above God. Why did we ever say that it has to do with Satan? Well, kind of it might, but we gotta do some work to get there. It's clearly not. By the way, whenever I say the word clearly, you can assume that I'm kind of being a little controversial because there is nothing clear about the Bible. And yet, the Reformers always talked about the perspicuity of Scripture, or the clarity of Scripture. What they meant was that it was clear in what its elocution, that's too big, but it was clear in what the authors were intending for you to ultimately hear about salvation and how the Gentiles are included. But it's not clear. It's not clear in every way. Calvin said that. All the Reformers, the Westminster says that, right? It's not clear in every way. It's not equally clear. So, anyway, sometimes it's hard. Why interpret the Bible? Because I only got 10 minutes left. Okay, when do we start interpreting? Holy mackerel. So, when do we start interpreting? You started interpreting as soon as you came out from mom, right? You've got to make some assumptions about whether this person is a good person or a bad person, right? And so you're doing it, even if you don't totally realize it. But certainly, as you start to grow up older and older, if you hear "come here" from your parents, you have to make some interpretation. So they mean come here right now, or is this the third come here? Right? Or is this a, hey, come here. And you're like, oh, I definitely want to come. Or it's come here. Yeah, I'm not going to come. Right? You can tell by the tone of how your parents act or how your spouse acts. Right? That's why interpretation that's why marriage is like the #1 sanctifying thing. Right? Because our spouses say something and we hear something that they might not mean, or we hear something they do mean, and this is what happens. Anybody have ever problems misinterpreting their spouse? Just a couple of them? Okay. I sure did. We interpret body language, don't we? Right? Can we go back to Song of Solomon, right? Certain body language says certain things. We know what that means. Hey, honey, come here. I know, man. I'm really tired tonight. You know, right? So, or let's just say that I'm up here and I wink at you because I'm saying something. I just kind of give you a wink. Okay? Yeah, don't wink. What does that mean? Am I flirting with her? Maybe. I might have hair in my eye. That's exactly right. Like, I cannot get this contact, right? Or I could, what else are the options for me winking? I'm joking, right? This is just a joke. You have to figure that out. Now, the person in the front row that I'm winking at might give me a call later on and say, yeah, I was like, no, it was just a hair in my eye. It all depends on how these are interpreted. Okay, so this is very important. So here we are, we're learning the rules of language, but there's no rules. It doesn't work that way. So how do we interpret? We interpret through something called grammatical historical interpretation. That's the way that we're told to do it today. We practice this every day. We look at the grammar of every article you read. If you're reading a newspaper, if you're reading something on the internet, if you're reading a meme, whatever it is that you're interpreting it, right? You're looking at the grammar. You're saying, wait, there's no comma there. That means something very important, right? Depending on what meme you're looking at. If a comma's not there, you can eat your grandmother. Or, you remember all those? Some of you know what I'm talking about. All right? Grammar is important, but so is history, right? So if you get something in the mail that tells you that this is on sale at Owen's, and you're like, excellent. This is great. I need this week. Fruit Loops is exactly what I needed. They're on sale for $2. The history is important, right? Not just the grammar. You have to know whether this came out a year ago or just got here, right? So you got to know what's going on in the time that it was written. That's very important. So we do history. We do this naturally, automatically, most of the time. Sometimes we screw it up. And we show up at Owens with our coupon, and they say, this is from 1963. This is a no right? We weren't even here. It's another Owens in another state. But we do this naturally. But there are other ways to interpret. Tons of other ways. I've already told you about allegory, right? Where we just kind of make things connect to other things. By the way, our confession and the Reformers constantly say it's something that we read in the Bible is grating to us, in the sense that it's evil or something like that, then we must interpret it by allegory. We must, because we can't allow God to have said something like that. So you're like, whoa, wait a second. Really? Can we just randomly interpret an allegory in any way that we want? I don't think that's right either. So this seems more smart. We're going to teach how to do this a little bit, but not too in-depth. But there's something else that's called reader's response. Okay, this is if you took literary criticism in in college or something like that, reader response is how you read into the text. And you are supposed to read into the text. That's natural. We'll talk about that when we get to presuppositions. But all of you have baggage that you bring to the text. Very different than the baggage that I bring to the text. Right? I read marriage things very differently than some of you do. If you're single, or if you've been married for a long time versus someone who's widowed, we see those passages differently. We just can't help but see them differently. Okay? Anytime that there's music being played in the text, like a psalm or something like that, those of you who are gifted in musical ways, you see that differently than I do. That's a good thing. And maybe you're supposed to. Maybe even some texts are written for you that aren't so written for others. I don't know. Then there's this whole critical approach. By the way, critical is not bad. All of you are critical all the time. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. Right? Some of you might be critical in a negative sense too. But right, we all critique things. We all say, no, this isn't good enough. I need to say this better. Right? Sometimes we do it in our head even before we say it. If we're really smart, husbands, right? We think ahead and we rephrase the way, that's criticism. Okay, but there's all kinds, there's source criticism, there's form criticism, there's redaction criticism, there's canonical criticism, all these different ways that we look at the text and we read these things. So if you, like I said, the Bible doesn't get handed down to you, it comes from sources from previous to the authors in some cases. So like Torah, if Moses is the writer of Torah, he almost certainly had sources, written or oral, that he was bringing from others into that text. Okay, and he brings it in, and then he starts editing it. He puts it here, and then he puts the other story here. No, I don't like that story here. I'm going to put it here. He does all of that for a reason. He's shaping the text. You've got to know about that kind of stuff. Some of you are thinking, well, I'll never be able to understand anything. No. The great thing is someone's already done some of this work for you. You understand you can never understand anything in the Bible, right? Without experts helping you. Can I just, like some of you thinking, well, I'll never be able to understand unless Jace is here to help interpret. That's not what I'm doing. This is not magisterial. This is not, well, if you just listen to me, you'll learn all the right things. You just have to understand, all of us have to rely on experts in order to understand this. It's written in Hebrew. Right? So interpretation has already been done in translation. So you've already relied on the experts. So all I'm saying is you need to rely on the experts in other areas too. They're going to help you understand some of these things. Some of this you're going to learn how to do just naturally. Even in 12 weeks, you're going to learn how to do some of these things. They'll just start coming to you more and more. You'll see it. I'll ask you questions like, what did Jesus say in this passage? We're doing the Sermon on the Mount. You understand those are not Jesus' words. There was nobody recording Jesus' words there. Okay? There's probably nobody who even had the ability to write them down. You understand that? Best scenario, 10% of people were literate. And that's literate in the sense that they could read words, not that they could put grammar and sentences together like that. The chances of Luke writing this are pretty high. The chances of Mark having written it, pretty low. Okay? They're probably not writing what he's saying, but it's an oral culture. So they're hearing things. By the way, that's why Matthew and Luke record things differently. And that's not a bad thing. Jesus may have said a lot more things. So I want to ask why Matthew is recording these words. Not why Jesus wrote them, but why does Matthew decide to record them? What is he doing in his context and putting them right here in Matthew chapter 5 instead of much later in his passage? Right? Why does John have him doing the temple and cleaning out the temple early, while another one has him cleaning it out at the end of his ministry? You say, well, he must have done it twice. Probably not. It's they're shaping the text in a certain way. That's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing. It shouldn't scare you. It should open up all kinds of cool new things. All right, but I got to keep going because I only have a few minutes. All right, presuppositions. So how do we interpret methods and presuppositions? And I've kind of already talked about that. Do not be deceived into thinking that we can scientifically understand Scripture. Like if you just have all the rules, then you'll get all the right answers. We're going to learn methods, but it's not a science. Methods change for different generations. Okay, early on we had more allegory, now we have more grammatical historical. It's moving back towards allegory now. A lot of scholars are seeing the beauty in allegory, but there's other ways to do it too. Okay? And what Paul is doing with the Old Testament is just, I gotta say, just weird sometimes. and what Jesus is doing. Have you ever heard some of Jesus' arguments when he's arguing with the rabbis, and you're like, I can answer that. Why are the rabbis not being able to answer that? Or that doesn't make any sense. Is he really using the Old Testament that way? That's not at all what the Old Testament meant. But you just say, no, well, Jesus said it, so it must be what the Old Testament meant. Yes, but he's bringing new life into it. You've heard it said, but I say to you. So he is changing it, but not changing it. That's a hard thing to grasp. Again, we're just playing right now. We're not dealing with all that. So what's the need for interpretation? Because the church is woefully inadequate in reading the Bible. If you podcast like I podcast, you listen to sermons out there, people just hear some phrase and then they tell you stories about it. And we're not interpreting Scripture. We're not asking, what does this Scripture mean to them, and therefore, what can I apply to me? Right? We're just bouncing off a cool phrase. Right? Some of you use Spurgeon's devotionals or Calman, Streams in the Desert or something, and you see that little verse up there, and then they just bounce off that little verse. There's no context, there's no understanding of the actual verse, there's just a word that made them think of something, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not interpretation. Usually I do Calman, Streams in the Desert sometimes, I enjoy it. But it's like, this is some good information, but it's not really based on that text. And that's what I'd like to do. I think that we can restore the art of preaching and actually make it textual again. Not where we just throw in some verses that proof text what it is we're saying, but actually expositorily work through a text and see the context of what Jesus is doing. That's why I tell you every week what Jesus is doing and letting things sprout up around. Right? This is what he's doing in the big picture of this. Not just one little tiny piece. I want you to see how it's all connected. So Christians are not seriously interested in dividing the truth, right? Dividing the word of truth. We just want our 1 minute devotional. And we don't want to know what Jesus really had to say or what Paul or whoever really had to say. And let's just be honest. We don't want to know because it just takes too much time. And sometimes it makes us have to change who we are. And we'd rather just be fed good information, right? I came to church, so I learned something about God. What about the rest of the week? Every passage of Scripture must be interpreted, even the ones that are, quote, obvious. Joseph's multicolored coat, well, it obviously means this. What? Why does it obviously mean that? Do you understand that there's a controversy over whether it's multicolored or whether it's long-sleeved? No. Have you ever heard about his long-sleeved coat? No. Because that doesn't sound exciting, does it? We know Joseph's Technicolor dream coat, right? And I don't know if it really matters. The point of it is that he was given a favorable coat, better than his brothers. But those are little interpretive things that we've got to do. So none of the passages are obvious what they mean. Like, you've always known what Genesis chapter 3 means, a fall and that. But there's a lot of, Irenaeus and Augustine disagreed strongly. These are two totally different interpretations that have gone down through the centuries. You've bought into the Augustinian one because you're in a Reformed church. I think Augustine totally mistranslated Romans 5:12 when it deals with those passages. He was a terrible Greek scholar. Augustine. He's better than me, but that's not saying anything because I'm the Old Testament. Okay. We presuppose a lot. I gotta wrap this up. We presuppose when we come in here a lot. So the need for interpretation is so important because you come to the text and you already have your grid laid out on the text. You know what it means. Some of you know it's a grace brethren. Some of you know it's a reformed grid. Some of you have a very dispensational grid. You see everything premillennial, rapture. You see all these things and they all come into your mind. Rapture's not talked about in the Bible, but you seem to think it is. Right? There's one little passage that talks about in the twinkling of an eye, we're going to disappear, right? We're going to be transformed, and they're going to be out there hoeing in the field. One's gone, one's left, and you're just like, okay, this is the end of time, and the good people are brought up. And who says the good people are brought up? What if the good people are left behind, and the bad people are? In fact, actually, it's probably more honest to the text. But we just have our grid, and we don't even stop to ask the right questions. I want us to read one of the first principles is reading slowly. Ask questions of the text Think about it a little bit differently. See how it behaves. Let it behave the way it behaves instead of forcing it to behave the way you want it to behave. Right? I believe the Bible is inerrant, so it can't be wrong, so this verse must agree with this verse. And then we just like, well, I don't know how, but it must agree. Let the tension of these two texts wash over you. It's the tension in the text that often tell you the purpose of the author. Why did Mark say it differently than Matthew did? Because Matthew is copying Mark, by the way, and he's purposefully changing. Why would he be doing that? He's got a reason. That tells you the reason he's writing. Luke is writing to the poor. Matthew's writing to Jews. There's a reason for why they're writing these stories. They're doing it with certain intentions. Okay, so we have presuppositions. And so the final thing is our approach. How we're going to deal with this. I want to deal with hermeneutics, big picture kinds of things, philosophical kinds of things, like meaning, history, what is truth, right? Because truth isn't as easy as you think it is either. Right? This is a question that Jesus got asked. What is truth? Okay, truth, well, that means historical. No, not necessarily. Poems are also truth, but not history. Right? Parables are truth, but not history. What is truth? We need to ask questions of what is truth. What is unity? Are these texts tied together? Does Isaiah have 3 different authors? Most scholars think Isaiah has 3 authors. There's not one author of that text. Okay, most scholars would say the Torah has not one author, but multiple authors. Tons of different authors, perhaps. And then we want to deal with special hermeneutics. Okay, like genre kinds of things. What do you do with narratives? How come narratives are different than other things? What about when things show up like Once Upon a Time? Or other genre indicators? Like, for instance, let me just mess with you here for one last second before we leave, right? What if an animal in a story starts talking? You know what an animal in a story talking means, right? It means we're not talking about history. But you all believe that the story in Genesis is history. I think. So why? I'm not arguing for anything right here, but why? What makes you do that? I'm trying to just ask you questions that you should be asking yourself. If a crow and a fox are having a conversation about food, you know it's a fable. Right? There's a genre indicator. Animals talk, fable. Done. But not when it comes to the Bible. Right? What do you do with that passage where Lazarus and Abraham in the bosom, right, and all that stuff? It doesn't say it's a parable, but it sure looks like a parable. Is it real? Should we take our theology from that? You know, can Abraham see across the chasm to the... What do we do with that? These are the kinds of questions we're going to ask. First, we need to ask the right questions before we can learn how to answer them. But I got to go preach and do other stuff. So, hopefully maybe some of you will come back. But let me pray for unity in case I really tick somebody else off. I really tried not to. I really tried to make this light. And I just need you to know I'm purposefully trying to stretch your minds. I'm not trying to tell you the way the Bible should be right now. Okay? I'm just saying it's a little bit more complicated than we in our 1-minute devotional think it is. It's still God's Word. He still has an answer. There's still answers in here. It's still beautiful. Okay, so if you're thinking like, I don't love this, I mean, this is what I've given my whole life to this, right? I do love this and what this points to very much. So, okay, Father, thank you for these who maybe, hopefully, will be a little stretched today, but I pray for unity among us too. That we would love you intensely and one another, and that we would have a good time discussing, because that's why you've done it, so we can wrestle with these kinds of things, wrestle with you in a sense, the divine, so that we can understand you and your world better. Help us as we move forward, that we would interpret well, that we would know what you have to say, and that we would be changed because of it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.